Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Civic Action Podcast, the voice of the next generation. My name is Maurice and I'm the founder and executive director of Virtutem Populo. Virtutem Populo is a student-led 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting civic engagement and community involvement among youth in Miami-Dade County. We do this through programming, advocacy, and education. The Civic Action Podcast is one of the ways in which we carry out our mission. Today we have a very special guest, and that is Mr. J.C. Planas. He is a professor of law at St. Thomas University and a former member of the Florida House of Representatives. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Planas.
How are you? Great to be here with you again. I think we did a Constitution Day seminar once. But,
Absolutely, yes. Mr. Planas was one of the guests at last year's Constitution Day event. We had over 100 middle schoolers there. It was the first event that Virtutem Populo hosted as an organization, and since then we've grown and expanded and do all these civics events across the county. But you were with us from the start, and we're very grateful for that. And we're happy to have you today. So just to kind of kick things off, for the students watching and teachers and all of our guests, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
Well, it's funny. I talk about the fact that I've been involved in politics and public service since I was 8 years old. In 1978, my family lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and the mayor of Jacksonville, who was a friend of my parents, was running for governor. And we traveled all around the state with Hans Tanzler for governor. And when he loses in the primary, we all jump aboard the campaign of a then unknown state senator from Miami Lakes named Bob Graham, who ended up becoming the first governor that I ever met. And we campaigned for Graham in the 1978 gubernatorial election. So it was kind of instilled in me from the very beginning. It's really something I have loved. I've loved public service my whole life. When it came time to go to college, I went to Florida State just because I wanted to work in the Capitol. And I was an intern, and in my last year in college, I was a legislative aide for a member of the House. So I came back, I worked for a county commissioner, Alex Pinellas, who's also a Miami Lakes resident. And I know you know it. I worked for Alex for 2 years before I went to law school. I went to law school at St. Thomas, and I then was a state attorney for 3 years. And seeing how the juvenile justice problem was, that's when I decided to run for a seat in the state legislature. And I got elected to the Florida House in 2002. And what's interesting is my opponent didn't like the fact that I beat him, so he sued. And that's how I learned election law. And I had an election 4 years later that was very litigious. So when I leave the House of Representatives in 2010, I knew more about election law than most of the other attorneys. So I started getting calls from all sorts of candidates and all sorts of elected officials to be their election lawyer. And that led to probably what is the greatest blessing of my life in my professional career, is to be a professor of election law, again, at St. Thomas University School of Law, where I went to law school.
That is a great story. And just before we continue with all the government things, which I'm very fascinated by your background, I quickly want to touch base on Florida State. So you went away for college, and that's something that I like to touch on with most of our guests, because a lot of our students listening, and I see this with my friends at school and with high school students that I talk to, it's that a lot of them that come here, they live in Miami or Hialeah, Miami Lakes, in the area. A lot of their parents are maybe scared to let them go away, or, they're unable to, and they're a little nervous about that. I have several friends who they're not sure whether to go away for or not. And I always tell them, I think go for it because it's a great experience.
It was a phenomenal experience. I went to Miami-Dade for 2 years first, and I'm a proud Miami-Dade College alumni. And then I went to Florida State, and specifically because that's where the Capitol was.
Right.
But you learn so much about life. You learn to do laundry. Most of the kids who live at home have never done laundry. It was different for me because I cooked, so I would cook for everybody, and I'd have all my friends come over to eat my cooking. When I was in the legislature, that's how I got my bills passed. I used to cook for the committee chair. But going away to college is really an experience. My kids are 10 and 12, and I've talked to them about the fact that, we're going to give you options. We're going to actually take you on a college tour. We want you to see other places, and not just state schools, although the state universities are great, but I want them to see niche schools as well for things that they may want to do.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think today more than ever, there's so many scholarships out there and so many different opportunities. So we're always promoting, for students to really do their research and look into that. So and a lot of them do start off at Miami-Dade for 2 years because they have great programs there as well.
It's a wonderful foundation.
Absolutely.
A wonderful foundation.
And a lot of kids from Miami-Dade, they go to top universities across the country. So it's definitely a stepping stone for many. So talk to me a little bit about your experience in the Florida House. You were first elected in 2002.
Yes.
You got termed out there.
In 2010, yes.
Awesome. Okay. So 4 terms you
yes.
said.
I'm not a fan of term limits when it comes to government. I think it, just when you're learning the rules, I think they kick you out. I also think that it empowers staff, empowers lobbyists probably too much. I think when members had more seniority, and they could do their job more effectively. But I will say term limits is the best thing to ever happen to families of politicians because it forces them to go back home. I was blessed that I didn't even have kids until after I termed out. So my kids never got to suffer with, me having to leave every day. That's tough.
So if the term limits weren't there, would you have run for re-election again?
I may have done one more term, but probably come back after.
Okay. Yeah. So you're not.
The process changed a lot while I was there.
Okay.
It was very different when I left than when I started.
Got it. And so you're not a fan of term limits. How do you feel about, now especially, you hear a lot about it in the news, and a lot of young people are talking about it, which is like age limits. Both of our presidential candidates right now, the ones that are leading in the polls on both, obviously the incumbent President Biden and in the Republican side, Donald Trump is leading. They're both pretty, older gentlemen. Some people are questioning whether should there be an age limit. What do you think?
First of all, I don't think it could ever be constitutional. You'd have to pass a constitutional amendment to have that. But, look at it this way. 70 now is completely different than even when I was a kid. It was inconceivable. I remember Reagan was in his late 60s in 1980, and that was considered very old, but that's not considered very old anymore. Today. I think that, the way people are taking care of themselves, the way we've solved a lot of other chronic diseases, I do think that 70, 75, even 80 is way different than it used to be.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And now when we talk about elections and the election department, so Miami-Dade County, for the first time in a while, is having a lot of these partisan positions being elected.
Since the 1950s.
1950s.
So there's a couple of things that happened. In the mid-50s, our home rule charter gets enacted in the state constitution. Miami-Dade's home rule charter was special and different than the other home rule charters. That's when it was the Metro-Dade charter in the 50s. And so these positions, for the most part, became eliminated. Supervisor of elections was actually called election clerk back then, but tax collector, property appraiser, they all go in-house. Sheriff stays an elected position until a scandal in the 60s, the county eliminated it. In 1968, the state adopts a new constitution that makes these constitutional offices in every county except for Miami-Dade County. So from 1968 until now, every other county in the state has elected a property appraiser, tax collector, supervisor of elections, and sheriff. In 2018, the Florida Constitutional Revision Commission, their goal was to actually have an elected sheriff in Dade County, and they couldn't do that without making the other positions elected as well. So other counties have been able to eliminate the partisanship, and through a state statute, we could eliminate the partisanship of the office. But right now it's enshrined in the Constitution that it has to be how most other states are. So we're going to have a partisan elected position for property appraiser, supervisor of elections, tax collector, and sheriff now in 2024.
And how do you feel about that? I mean, me personally, I think I wouldn't call it dangerous, but there's definitely some concern when it comes to, especially the election department and the sheriff being
as
a
someone who's running
position.
for supervisor of elections. It's ironic that I would say this, but I never supported it. I was against it. I campaigned against it. I believed that it should have been taken off the ballot. The county actually sued to take it off the ballot, and I think they were right. I think it should be up to each and every county individually to decide if these are going to be positions. I definitely don't believe it should have ever been a partisan race. Now, it's elected and it's a partisan race, and Miami-Dade has one of the best supervisors of elections in the state of Florida, and I've worked on elections all over the state. I can tell you Miami-Dade is the best, but she did not want to be a politician.
Right.
So when she decided not to run, it was my students in election law at St. Thomas who started all of a sudden emailing me, "Oh, you have to run, you have to run." And they were the ones that convinced me. But here I am running for this partisan position, and I don't believe it should be partisan, and I never believed it should be elected. But this is what we have, and I'm a Democratic candidate, but I'm running to be a supervisor for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk about partisanship. I think there was just a bill passed in the legislature to make an item on the ballot for school board members to become partisan positions.
So it used to be up to the late 90s when I was growing up in this town, school board members were partisan. And they were also at large. They weren't district seats.
Right.
It would, for school board, it would definitely not make sense. I think the public will reject that.
Hopefully, yeah.
But we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. And so you spoke about your Democratic candidate for supervisor of elections. You were a Republican in the House. So you switched parties. Do you feel that? Did you have a lot of critique? Was there a lot of feedback from the outside?
I think I just didn't fit in. Am I bothered by a lot of the election denialism that happened in 2020? Yes. And that was a big part of it. But again, I think that me and the party were going separate ways. And a lot of people, Al Cardenas, who used to be the chair of the Florida Republican Party, is not really a Republican anymore. There's a lot of folks like me. That being said, when I decided to run, I used to be on the Republican legal team for elections, and I'm on the Democratic legal team. But I texted all the folks on the Republican legal team, and I said, "Listen, you may not vote for me, you may not support me, but I want you to know that if I'm elected to this position, you will have an open door policy in my office, as if I was still one of you. I'm going to absolutely have all people at the table if I'm supervisor of elections, and they're going to be able to, to come into the office and scream at me like everybody else."
Yeah, and if you look at young people as well registering to vote, I'm pre-registered, and any students watching starting at age 16, you can pre-register to vote, which I think is a great thing. But you'll see in larger numbers young people, a lot of them registering also as MPA, as nonpartisan. Do you think that kind of speaks as to the political climate we live in today?
It's funny. I teach in undergrad at St. Thomas as well. And last year I taught a class in American political parties. And we did a quiz to self-identify. And we had all of these students take the quiz, and they fell on the political spectrum. Some were, right-wing, some were left-wing. Yet some of these, it's funny, one of the ones that was registered Republican came in the survey as more liberal. One of the ones that was registered Democrat came in the survey as more conservative. And then the ones that were NPAs were almost half and half. There were a couple of NPAs that really were on the middle on a lot of issues. And one of the things we talked about is Florida is a closed primary state.
Correct.
So it limits your voice in who the nominees are if you are registered NPA. And we talked about that. But my biggest problem was, here's a class of 20 political science students, and yet only 3 of them voted.
Oh, wow.
And one of them wasn't even registered to vote. And I'm like, you're studying political science? Why aren't you even registered to vote? She's like, oh, I had an issue with my father on registering. I'm like, you're an adult. You know, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were celebrated for raising the awareness and participation of what's called the youth vote, which is that 18 to 25. And what people forget is they were celebrated for this, but the youth vote only went up like 2 or 3%. And that's how low the youth vote is. Yeah. That a 2 or 3% increase
is seen as like a huge celebration. Huge. Yeah.
This is a problem. And I tell my students, I'm like, you know, number one, climate change is going to affect you more than anybody else. Number two, we're straddling you with debt in the country. You're going to be the ones to pay that back. There are so many issues that we have kicked the can down the road. How are you not voting? Why are you not the first in line? And I've never missed a presidential or a gubernatorial election. I don't think I've ever even missed a primary. You know, I've never missed an election since I was 18.
It's very, very concerning. And when you talk about the youth vote, just to get your thoughts on, so in this podcast, we like discussing different things that are going on. And a lot of the students, you know, they message us that they learn a lot of talking about these items that they typically wouldn't have heard about. And one of these ideas that I was reading about, and it was actually proposed in the town a while back, and it was shut down. It was voted down by the council. I think it was like a 6-1 vote against. Mm-hmm. But it's a pretty interesting idea that's been adopted in some cities, which is that local municipalities have actually lowered their voting age to 16 for local elections. What are your thoughts? It's pretty controversial issue. Some feel strongly for, some against. In the town, it was voted down.
I would tend to support something like that. But, you know, I can tell you right now, we passed something like that, and I can only see, you know, maybe 10 16-year-olds even taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
I don't know. There are logistical problems. As someone who is running for supervisor and knows the office, there are, because remember, the municipalities have to hire the supervisor to run the elections. So, you know, you'd issue a voting ID only for a municipal election, and you'd have to find a way to code that voter and identify that voter that they can only vote in that municipal election. And then the municipal elections are also run at the same time as the regular general election. So it would be a separate ballot for that voter.
I get what you're saying.
There are logistical issues.
But it can be done.
Yes. How expensive it would be and how much more manpower it would require, I think, is something. But it is logistically challenging. And I can tell you that, you know, I could see members of the town being concerned over the cost.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Especially, so when it comes to cost, you mentioned that's increasing nationally. Do you think your view has really changed a lot when it comes to, you know, fiscal issues from the time you were in a House as a Republican to now as a Democrat? Or
on most fiscal issues, my views have not changed. I still believe that I'm a fiscally conservative Democrat. I still believe that not everything has to be a paid for program. I believe that we have to bring our fiscal house into order. I do believe that we can successfully raise revenue without necessarily creating a tax increase that would hurt the economy. I think you can close loopholes, and we should. I think that there are a lot more ways to increase revenue, but I do think that in some cases, some spending has to be cut.
Absolutely.
And we've seen bipartisan commissions that have proposed a combination of spending cuts with revenue increase, and both parties sadly have walked away. The one area where I probably have become more liberal, and that had a lot to do with COVID, really is in healthcare. I went from being an opponent to the Affordable Care Act to a supporter of the Affordable Care Act. As a capitalist country, what is our duty? Our duty as a capitalist country is to raise our GDP. That is how we determine that we are prospering as a capitalist country. You can't raise the GDP if workers are sick. We need to provide health care. Workers need health care. It's not a socialist thing, it's a capitalist thing. The other issue is I was always very pro-immigration. I think our country has turned way too anti-immigration. You can't expand the GDP without more workers. And why are people coming here? Because we have jobs. People don't want to come illegally. They want to come legally. We need to expand the way we accept immigrants. We need to increase the amount of immigrants that we accept because our economy depends on it. We still have a labor shortage. Some states are actually lowering voter working ages. They're repealing child labor laws, which I think is ridiculous and horrible because they have such a labor shortage. No, we have people that are coming into this country that want to work. We have a problem with Social Security in this country because not enough money is going into the Social Security fund. Just the folks that are here that are undocumented, if we legalize them immediately, we could shore up Social Security for 10 years because they'd be paying into the system. So this anti-immigrant fervor that I don't know where it comes from is a very bad thing for the country, because if we are going to maintain ourselves as a prosperous capitalist nation, we need more immigrants, we need better treatment for workers, and we need healthcare for workers. This is a capitalist thing. It's not a liberal thing.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the fact that governments can raise funds without having to increase taxes.
Well, without having to increase tax rates and increase taxes on people that hurt. You can close loopholes of businesses. Some businesses that pay no taxes should be paying taxes. If you're making over $500,000 a year, you can afford a marginal tax increase. The problem has always been with the fact that, when you raise taxes on folks that make less than $500,000, the problem is, $200,000 in Miami is different than $200,000 in Orlando.
Absolutely.
$200,000 in Florida is different than $200,000 in Iowa. So that's why you have to have a higher level in which you raise taxes.
Well, when you look at the county as well, I think this year they're getting even $1 billion in increased revenue than last year purely from the airport and the port of Miami. So there's always different ways. And something that I just wanted to mention for the students to also understand is that even in years where taxes don't increase, the government is probably still getting more money just because, at least at the local level, the home prices are going up. Yeah. So sometimes, like Miami Lakes, I know that you just rolled back taxes 10%, but really they're getting about the same money because the home prices are going up.
Miami-Dade County is a very difficult government to handle. Miami-Dade County is bigger than 20 of the states. We're bigger than some countries. So it is not an easy feat by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How many municipalities? There's 32, 30?
Yes, but they're all of different degrees. You have...
They're also different. Each one of them, different type of people
they're
live
different.
there.
You have, right now next week we have the election of what we call the Big Four: Miami, Miami Beach, Hialeah, Homestead. And as far as size, those are the top sizes of the municipalities. Miami Lakes, where we are now, is somewhere in the middle. I live down south, right by, Pinecrest, Palmetto Bay, Cutler Bay, which are municipalities roughly in size of Miami Lakes.
Yeah. So that's definitely something to consider, which is how difficult it is to manage such a large county. And when you play it at the national level, that's where I think a lot of our issues also come from the fact that the United States is so incredibly big. The founding fathers definitely had. I don't think they would have imagined the size of of this country. I mean, they had a lot of things in place, but it's gotten huge.
You know, it's when you talk about the founding fathers, you were always going to get into the debate of Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians. When you look at what we've become, Hamilton was by far the more of a visionary. Jefferson thought we'd still be farmers. I mean, he wanted us to still be farmers. I don't believe that they envisioned what the modern technological and modern city would be like, which it goes into, you know, a lot of these, you know, something that's also made me more liberal is a lot of this originalist thought of constitutional interpretation. You know, I'm sorry, but we're not farmers. And a lot of the, you know, when you really look at the plain language of the original Constitution, women weren't even people. Right. So there are a lot of things that they left out and a lot of things they did not consider.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to quickly switch over to a more modern issue, and this is, you know, as we start wrapping up, something that's been debated for the past few years, and I think it's important for our high school audience to kind of hear both sides, which is voter ID. Mm-hmm. That's something that's being discussed in many different states. So, what are your thoughts on that?
You know that Florida's never had our voter ID law challenged. Florida actually has the best voter ID law in the country. There are states that have had completely discriminating voter ID laws where, you know, it's only a government type ID and it really makes it harder for people to vote. Florida's never had that problem. In Florida, we have our tier 1 and our tier 2. As long as you have a combination of something with a picture and something with an address, you can vote.
That could be something like a water bill even?
A Costco card with your picture and the water bill, you can vote.
Right.
Now, it'll take you a little while longer.
Yeah, sure.
You get in there and they have to call and they'll identify it and they'll get it, but you'll get to vote because you have a picture and a driver's license and an address. Obviously, we want to encourage folks with driver's license because it speeds up the process. They just scan it. But, you know, if you are in residential housing, you have an ID there that allows you to vote. Florida has a litany of things that you can use as an ID to the point that it has avoided any of the legal challenges that any of these other states that have had discriminatory practices in their ID laws. So I'm in favor of Florida's law, which has worked well and has never even been challenged.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So there's no other states that have the same laws as Florida?
There are states that have similar laws. There are states that have less restrictive laws. And I will say this, in the states with less restrictive laws, you really haven't seen many problems at all. You really don't. I mean, let's be honest. You don't have the thing where someone's like going to go try to go. We have a hard enough time getting people to vote once. This thought that people are going to vote 2 or 3 times is really not a realistic issue. Same thing with vote by mail ballots. It goes to your house.
And then it leaves your house.
The majority, believe it or not, a large percentage of the folks don't even fill it out. It just stays, especially in the August primary, it stays in that mail pile,
they don't even use it
on their desk. Yeah. So, this thought that there's this voter fraud, in cases, believe it or not, where there is voter fraud, you see it immediately the next day after an election is certified. You can see the anomalies in the spreadsheet of the results fairly easily.
And those can be removed.
They can't be removed, but there's been cases where they've invalidated elections. But, first of all, there's no such thing as voter fraud without the voter being complicit. And I think that's something that people don't really realize. In the few cases that I've seen it, the voter gives away their vote. But you can't steal a vote from a voter. The ballots are coded in a certain way. The vote by mail ballot gets to your residence and, you have to sign it. And if your signature doesn't match, it gets rejected.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to come on. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me here.
I think we've had some great discussions. This has been the Civic Action Podcast, everybody. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on YouTube. I just want to give a special thank you to the Miami Lakes Chamber of Commerce for supporting us, and to Mayor Manny Sid for letting us use his wonderful studio. What do you think? It's pretty nicely
Very
painted.
nice studio. Very
it
nice
was
studio.
actually painted by a high school or a middle school trust counselor that would come here at nights to paint this. So
awesome.
It's awesome art installation. Well, thank you
thank
for
you very
being here,
much.
and thank you guys for watching.
Thank you.